great to have everybody here from so many time zones. Been talking to people today from the East Coast, the West Coast, and the way west out in Hawaii. One of our grant recipients got up very early this morning to join us from Hawaii. So we're grateful for everyone being here. We are at 12:45 now Eastern time, so that's our starting time. And others may be joining us, and we're glad for that, but I just want to say welcome as we begin. I'm Kathy Smith. I'm the leader of the Vital Worship Grants team and delighted to moderate this webinar with our teacher scholars. Some of you are probably aware that the teacher scholar part of the Vital Worship Grants program was new last year. And so the folks who are presenting today in this panel and in the other panels are the inaugural group. So we're really excited about this. The Worship Grants program has been in existence since the year 2000 and has been focused on worshiping communities, mostly churches, but a lot of other organizations, schools, seminaries, hospitals, all sorts of places. But this new effort with teacher scholars is to add to the learning that we can all do together about worship and to add a more scholarly component. So our teacher scholars come from different universities and seminaries and schools, and they work and do their research in a lot of different disciplines. And the whole idea of this part of the program is to enrich our understanding of worship through that research that comes from different disciplines, and to think about how that research then can benefit the worship in the churches. So our goal is exactly what's happening today, that the teacher scholars and the worshiping community grantees are going to be learning together. So we're delighted that this is working out. This particular webinar is focusing on historical and contemporary cultural themes. There are 3 other webinars, and you'll be able to attend another one tomorrow. They're all being recorded so that you can watch them later as well. We have 3 teacher scholars with us in this session, and we will be taking them in this order. We have Martin Spence from Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he will be speaking to us first. After that, we'll hear from Kyle Dielman, who is professor at Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights, Illinois. And then our third one is Andrew Hofer, who is at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. And so we're excited to have them here and to hear about their projects. The format is each of them is going to take a few minutes to present their learning and their research to us in order. And we will see their poster for part of that time. Joanna's in the background and she'll be screen sharing with us. And then after we hear from all 3 of them, we're going to have some discussion. And the way that we'll do that is through the Q&A feature. So if you look at your buttons either on the top or the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button, and that's the place for you to put a question that you would like to ask. And either for all of the scholars here or for one of them. And then after we've heard from all 3, I will take those questions and present them to our panelists. Okay, so great, let's get started. Joanna, do you want to share? Or Martin, let's hear from Martin. You want to introduce yourself? And then we'll take a look at your poster while you're doing that. Let's see, we've got the whiteboard, so we'll go back to the poster. There we go.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Martin Spence. So my project this year was looking at nationalism and national identity and its connection with worship, and to discern how the study of history might help the church develop worship patterns that respond to nationalism. And I've done a variety of things this year, some of which you can see there on the poster. I ran a reading group with a local church. I organized a panel at a professional historians conference in New York, and also spent a lot of time reading and thinking and buying books, some of which are actually propping up my laptop at the moment, so it's at the right level to speak to you. And so I want to share, in some ways, some of the thoughts of my reading on this topic of nations and nationalism in the time that I've got with you today. Now, when we hear that word, and I finished with the slide. When we hear the word nationalism, we perhaps think of something that is belligerent, militaristic, exclusive, arrogant. I want to invite you to think that nationalism is actually something much more kind of basic and fundamental than that. It's a taken for granted understanding that the world is split naturally into defined territories, each of which have their own government. And nationalism assumes that within those territories, there is a common people, a nation, who share a common culture and a common identity, which unites them. They are one family. They are presumed to share the same historical story, acknowledge the same historical ancestors, and take part in the same national anniversaries. And since this is presumed to be your land, your fatherland, your homeland, then nationalism says that you owe a measure of allegiance and loyalty to this nation, just as you would do to your family. You should give to it, in the words of one English patriotic song of the early 20th century, the love that asks no questions. And much of this will seem very ordinary to us, not chest-thumping, angry nationalism, but just the flag fluttering on the gas station forecourt, the pledge taken at the start of every school day, the anthem that plays at the start of every sports game. It just is. Except for much of history, it just wasn't. This idea that we have of the world being divided into nations and what nations demand from us is very new. It didn't really emerge until the late 18th century. Now, before this time, there were certainly governments with militaries and laws and taxes and all the rest of it. These are what political scientists call sovereign states. But the people that lived under these governments didn't necessarily feel any sort of allegiance or loyalty to the state in which they lived, or to the other people who lived in that state with them. There were no binding national images, no flags, no anthems. Meanwhile, we do find the word nation cropping up before the modern period, but it really just means a group of people from the same place. It shares the same root word as the word nativity, birthplace. These nativity groups, nations, didn't correspond in any particular way to the boundaries of governed territories of states. And that means that when the Bible talks of nations, it's this more older meaning that is in mind, what we would probably call people groups or just peoples, rather than our modern understanding of what a nation is, with flags and borders and anthems and militaries. And interestingly, just as a kind of side point, some pre-modern Bible translations actually capture this better than our modern ones. So the Wycliffe translation, an English medieval translation, translates Revelation 7, a great picture of eschatological worship, of course. It says, I saw a great people of all folks, not nations, but folks, lineages and languages. In the modern era, kind of from the 19th century onwards, these two ideas, governments and states, and peoples, nations, merged. It has come to be assumed that if you are a people, a nation, you should have your own government, your own state. And in parallel, if you have a state, the people that live within that governed territory should learn to think of themselves as a discrete, united people group, one nation. This is what we call the nation state. Now, some of the reasons this has occurred are very complicated and take many pages of scholarship to work out. And some of them are the natural outworking of long-term historical processes. But this national idea was also something that was deliberately and consciously worked for. Nationalists have sought to build nations where they did not exist. This means that our modern nations are not God-given things. They have to some extent been engineered. As Massimo da Aglio, who was an Italian nationalist. He helped unify the Italian peninsula into one country, Italy, by 1871. He said this after unification: "We have made Italy. Now we have to make Italians." So how do you build a nation? How do you create a unified identity among a large, anonymous, disparate group of people? Now, one thing my reading has increasingly focused on for obvious reasons this year is how the appeal to biological unity, or supposed biological unity, race, has clearly been central to such a national project. I could speak more about that, and maybe in the Q&As I can, but as a side point, I think it means that we can't properly address racism in our worshiping communities without also addressing nationalism. They are twins. Another way of building national identity has been to project evocative images that encourage everyone's heartstrings to vibrate in union. In the United States and elsewhere, nationalism has often used highly Christian images, often drawn from the language and gestures of worship to achieve this. Actions such as standing and crossing one's heart for the anthem are kind of liturgical gestures which echo standing for the gospel, or genuflection, or the raising of hands in worship. The Pledge of Allegiance is the schoolchildren a daily creedal affirmation. And national songs redirect scriptural imagery to the praise of the nation. Let mortal tongues awake, let all that breath partake, let rocks their silence break, let everything that has breath praise my country and its holy liberty. Nationalism, I want to suggest, is spiritually formative, and it does its formative work in the same space, the zone of our individual and corporate affections and identities, as Christian worship. Moreover, and this is something I've really come to kind of late on in my thinking about this year, it does so for the same purpose as Christian worship, at least if you read Revelation 7 as the great statement about what worship's all about: to bring into unity a fragmented people. Out of the many, one is in fact the vision of Revelation 7 applied to the nation. And so there are two practical-ish conclusions I want to draw from this for you. First, some churches deliberately and overtly bring the nation to worship in the form of flags in the sanctuary, memorial 4th of July celebrations, and the singing of patriotic songs. Now, I'm not the first person to ask whether these things belong in the sanctuary. I know that Rob Huell, whose book I've used this year, has talked at Calvin Worship Symposium about this. And I believe with him and others that it's possible to make a strong biblical argument against the presence of these national symbols in worship. But since nationalism has been so very effective, and since the nation is so deeply loved and revered, making these arguments is difficult within a congregation, perhaps even controversial. The church I worked with this year narrated to me the controversy that broke out when they took down the flag and stopped marking Veterans Memorial Day. And so, and this is really in keeping with what the Scholar Teacher Grants have been all about and why they excited me, I want to encourage you to think about dealing with these controversial topics in an academic way. Because contrary to the stereotype of the word academic, as it's sometimes used in churches, meaning not much use, on these controversial topics, I think academic approaches can in fact be very practical. In particular, the slowness of the academic approach, its incremental telling of a story, particularly in my discipline of history, is the very thing that removes some of the threat from these topics if they were suddenly announced from the pulpit. Moreover, good teaching, and there's bad teaching, but good teaching encourages a freedom of dialogue and exchange that is not always modeled in the didactic authority structures of our church, perhaps empowering people to voice their own journeys and concerns in these issues. And of course, to fulfill this requires time and skill, and I'd love to see churches think about employing permanent scholars in residence who could work with the liturgical and pastoral staff to encourage such learning to happen and to culminate in renewed worship. And my second and final reflection is this: it's for churches that don't overtly bring the nation to church, who have already got rid of the flag from the sanctuary. I think for us, we must think about how our worship consciously recognizes the fact that there is an alternate, powerful, formative liturgy going on outside of the church. Without doing so, our Christian liturgy which should be directed towards retelling and anticipating the restoration of all things in Christ, is always being subtly diluted and counteracted by the alternative cultural liturgy of nationalism. And I'll finish with two open-ended questions. First, some of the language of worship that is potentially the most powerful opponent of nationalism has become so commonplace as to lose its punch. We happily sing, Majesty, King of Kings, above all powers, Jesus shall reign. Do our congregations really see these phrases as challenging the claims of the nation? Or does the somewhat archaic spiritual language of kingdom not really meet the claims of the modern nation state full on, allowing us to kneel for the king, but seeing no problem of then standing for the nation? How can we find new words that do that? And second, finally, since its rise in the 19th century, the power of nationalism, particularly over Christians, surely reveals that something's gone missing in Christian worship. As one historian noted, nationalism has more and more offered what religion once offered, a vision of heaven, though this time an earthly heaven. I think we should conclude that there never should have been space available for the nation to colonize the allegiance and loyalty of Christians in this way, least of all by using Christian language drawn from worship. What has gone wrong in Christian worship formation and discipleship is it has left such a large gap, hunger, for the community identity, ultimate meaning, sacrificial love, and allegiance that has been filled by nations and nationalism. And more importantly, how do we claim it back in our worshiping communities? Ironically, studying the history of nationalism might teach us something about the deep needs that nationalism has met, and thus lead us into patterns that can renew our worship, so we might fully express the hope of all folks singing as one people, indivisible, under Christ, with liberty and justice for all creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Fascinating. And we look forward to answering some questions that are going to be coming in, but we're going to hear from our other two panelists first, and then we'll come back to the questions. So now I'd like to turn to Kyle Dielman from Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights, Illinois. And Joanna's sharing the poster that he created. Kyle.
Thank you. So before I comment on a couple of the things on the screen for the poster, I'll begin actually with two stories. One of these stories is one that I uncovered as I was working in archives, and it comes from 1585. And the second story is one that I found out about when someone contacted me actually while I was doing my grant and shared this story with me. And the first, I'll use fake names. But the first happens to a woman named Francine. Francine was a member of a church, but hadn't been coming to the services, actually. She'd been absent quite a bit. And so the consistory, which if you're not familiar with that sort of language, think church board or groups of pastor and elders who meet together. And the consistory then was going to inquire as to why Francine had been not coming to church. She was also in a bit of trouble because she had a child that was about 1.5 years old, and that child still hadn't been baptized. And so the pastor and an elder go to visit her and go to ask what's happening. And Francine promised that she would do better, that she'd start coming to church, that she'd make sure she got her child baptized very soon. And it seemed to work, except about 5 years later, Francine was in trouble again because she had stopped coming to church and had in fact started to go to services with a more fringe religious group that may or may not be considered Christian. The second story is, we'll just call him John. John had lost his job and he had to take up a job as a miner, mining for various things. And that new job was going to require him to work every other Sunday. And when his consistory, again, that church board, heard about this, and he started missing church every other Sunday, they also thought that he needed a visit from the pastor and elder. And they told him that if he kept missing services for his job, that he was going to be disciplined and would be ultimately kicked out of his church. So both of those stories, of course, deal with disciplining the Sabbath or Sunday observance, if you're more familiar with that language. And so you can see on the poster, my project researches some some things about the Sabbath and Sunday observance as a means of identity formation. And so this is where I think my project flows very nicely with what Martin was doing with nationalism, to say, how does Sabbath observance help shape identity, help shape and form who we are? And so my project, I'm a historian at Trinity. And so part of that was looking, as I mentioned, at church records from the Reformation time period, 1600s, and seeing how they thought about Sabbath and what they did on Sundays and what they didn't do and what they were supposed to do and not supposed to do, and whether or not people followed all those things. And the other part of my research went a little bit outside of my field of expertise, and that was on the poster in the summary there. You can see the ethnographic part of this. And so the highlights on it's my right at least, side of the poster is that we did hold a couple of seminars with church leaders from our area and gave their congregants surveys to take about how they thought about Sabbath, what they did on Sundays and what they didn't do. And so tried to tie both this historical piece with people, church leaders' actual experiences today. And so we met twice in September to sort of gather their thoughts, and then in March to share some of the findings of the survey that their congregants took, and to share some things with them. And so thinking about the historical piece of this, I'll share with you just a little bit. So my research focuses mostly on the Reformed tradition. So the tradition that traces its origins to Geneva, Switzerland, and John Calvin. But my area of focus is mostly on the Dutch situations in the Low Countries, modern day Netherlands and Belgium. And one of the things, as I've researched this and found more throughout my grant period, is that the Low Countries at that time in the 15 and 1600s is a very religiously plural place. Maybe not in terms of like world religions, though there were some small Jewish and Muslim populations, but they thought of it more religiously plural in terms of different types of Christianity. And so the Low Countries was quickly to become a reformed country, but it also had a significant presence of Catholics. It has significant presence of Anabaptists, and it also had a large number of people who were simply religious and who really didn't want to participate in Christianity in any real sense at all, actually. And so the church, the Reformed Church, is trying to establish its community in this sort of pluralistic setting. And so what my argument is that Sabbath is one of the crucial ways they try and do this, that to get people to observe Sunday, primarily by going to church, participating in education things on Sundays, and then abstaining from a whole bunch of things, including work, but also including recreation and shopping and things like that, that was how they were trying to say, look, this is what it means to be reformed, right? And so, yes, maybe if you're Catholic, you can go to the market on Sundays after your service and you can do your shopping, but we Reformed people don't do that, right? Your friends are going out and riding their bikes or having their shooting competitions, but as part of the Reformed Church, we don't do that recreation on Sunday because that's not who we are, right? They were trying to use it as identity formation. And so if we think about that in terms of contemporary applications, one of the things that I found when I was listening to church leaders is that they feel like, at least the ones I talked to, that they were losing the battle actually in terms of identity formation. They shared things like they felt like their congregation was being formed more by youth sports. So they told stories about how people in their congregation would be in church until the clock hit 10:30, and then they'd be up and out because they had to make it to their soccer match, right, or their kids' soccer match. Or how they wouldn't see their young men all summer because that was baseball travel league, right? They felt like they were losing the identity battle to politics, and especially to talk radio. And so I had pastors tell me about wives coming into their office talking about how angry their husbands are because all they do at work is listen to talk radio and hear the hate spewed there, and all sorts of other things too, right? They talked about family and even just thinking about the language we use to talk about Sunday. You've probably heard Sunday is now a fun day, right? Sunday fun day is now the phrase, right? You might even think about the language of Sunday being the end of the week rather than the first day of the week, right? So you think about Sunday as being the end of my weekend rather than the beginning of a week. All those sorts of things made them often feel like they were losing the sort of formation battle. And so we had to think about what that meant and how they might navigate that. And so when we took the survey, we did get quite a few responses from these church members. We had something like 210 responses. We did also offer it to the college students this spring. This is where COVID interrupted our plans a little bit, and had roughly, I think it was 70 or 80 students take that. And we're going to process that with some of Trinity's folks in the fall. Our grant's been extended through then. And so when we were thinking about those results, one of the things we found is that a lot of people who were taking the survey, they reported actually being very well educated in their faith. Most of them were Christians for a long time. And yet when we started to ask them what Sabbath was actually about, they actually didn't have a very good sense of this, right? So the numbers are really high in I know my faith, I don't need sermons to tell me more about theology, I don't need a lot of education classes. Suddenly when we said, like, okay, is Sunday, Sabbath primarily about ceasing from work? Well, maybe. Or is Sunday actually about going to church, right? Is that what it is? Worship is actually the focus of Sabbath. Well, maybe. And they didn't exactly know how to navigate that. And so at least one of the things I think, if you're trying to take away from sort of my research, is that I think a lot of our folks actually don't really know what they're supposed to be doing on Sunday and what Sabbath is actually about. And I think I could even argue that that's maybe one of the reasons people simply stop coming. They just don't really see the point, actually. They don't, it's a sort of optional thing for them because they don't really understand what Sabbath is about. And so I think spending some time reflecting theologically on what Sabbath is meant to do and be is pretty important, actually. The other sort of takeaway, I think I have maybe a minute left here, that I would think about is trying to conceive of Sabbath as the people I study in history talked a lot about a spiritual Sabbath. And what I think they mean by that is that Sabbath is essentially practice for the Christian life. That God gives us one day to practice the Christian life because we're so bad at it the other 6 days. And so on Sunday, we go to hear the word preached because the rest of the week we might not open our Bibles, right? And so it's a practice to get us in the word. Why do you take an offering on Sunday, right? Because it's meant to practice generosity that's not supposed to just end on Sunday, right? But that's supposed to carry out throughout the week. And so again, I think the point here would be that Sabbath is a way to form identity for who you are for the rest of the week. And so making church, making worship, not just something you sort of do to check off your list, right? But Sunday as a way to sort of practice what you're supposed to be doing the rest of the week. I think if we can start to shift the framework of that, I think that's an important factor for us to consider. So I would be happy to answer your questions later, but I do think my time is up, so I don't want to take more than my share.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you. Again, very interesting presentation. And yeah, fascinating, that idea of identity and what Sabbath is really about. We will come back to questions, but we're going to hear from our third panelist now. So Andrew Hofer from the Dominican House of Studies. Now it's your turn. Let's hear from you about your research and your learning.
Andrew, you're still muted. You want to unmute?
We need.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Great.
can. And
All right,
I need to see the next poster.
Yes.
We're still on Trinity.
While we're waiting for the poster, I just want to thank the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship for this Teacher Scholar grant that supported my research this past year when I had a sabbatical from teaching at the Dominican House of Studies. And my research is called The Word in Our Flesh, A Return to Patristic Preaching. So what I've been doing is going back to the early centuries of the church and to recover models of what it means to be a preacher, especially for Christian communities today that are experiencing crises particularly regarding preacher credibility. So when we go back to antiquity, all sorts of religions and philosophies are concerned about the discrepancy between what people say and what people do. You just find this repeatedly. So in terms of various Greek philosophers, it's a common theme. You know, you have words, but I have deeds. In the Christian religion, we believe that the Word was made flesh, John chapter 1, verse 14. And so in Jesus Christ, the Lord, you have a perfection of the Word in human life. The Word was made flesh. Various early Christians then talked about how the Word is in our flesh. So St. Augustine is one who says that the Word made flesh is one thing, and that the Word in the flesh is in terms of the saints and the prophets. Okay, so the Word in the flesh. What I'm choosing for an image to represent this concept is from John chapter 15, and you see there on the poster, Christ the true vine. It's a Byzantine icon that has Christ in the center as the vine, opening the book of the Gospels to John chapter 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. And you see that the apostles who are gathered around him are branches on the vine, and each of the apostles holds either a scroll or a book, so that they actually have the Word. And just in terms of thinking about you really don't find branches without a vine, nor vine without branches. And so there's this unity. So that in terms of the discrepancy that is always a matter of a human problem, to go back to Jesus, that the Word was made flesh to have this perfection. So in my project, I have an introduction that looks at the problem. So in terms of how there's a lot of anger, a lot of sin, just many things that are going wrong because there's a discrepancy between what people say and what people do. And people are leaving many Christian communities because of the lack of preacher credibility. From that, then, to go back to the Word made flesh and to think of this in terms of the importance of the mystery of the incarnation, then the mystery of what I call deification. It's a term that's getting more and more popularity these days in terms of how that Christians are anointed with the Spirit of Christ and are called to be children of God, to resemble our merciful Father. So to look at that, and then how preachers in a special way are seen by various communities to hold an office where they are to communicate the Word made flesh through their words and their deeds. So from that, then, I look at 7 preachers in particular, and I use these in terms of a model that helps us think about some aspect of the Christian life. So the 7 range from the 3rd century through the late 6th century. 3 are Greek, 3 are Latin, and 1 is Syriac. So in terms of that diversity, and it's built in terms of 7 chapters, and each chapter begins with a current Christian leader who helps us understand what's at stake there. So to begin, we have Origen of Alexandria. And Origen's focus there is holiness, holiness that is something that we then take on a godlike activity, a godlike being. And what I do is I focus on his homilies on Leviticus. Many Christians find it difficult to read the book of Leviticus. Origen thought it was in terms of milk, vegetables, or strong meat. Leviticus is strong meat. You need to have maturity to be able to read Leviticus, and he sees every detail actually for our priestly holiness. And when he mentions priestly holiness, he's speaking to the baptized. It's the royal priesthood. Also, with each of these chapters, I have some sort of problem or discrepancy or some sort of accusation. Okay, so like Origen actually is not called Saint Origen by lots of people. He's just not called Saint Origen. In fact, he's accused of heresy. You have different Origenistic controversies. In the 530s, he was condemned during Emperor Justinian's time. So anyway, to think about Origen, the next one is Ephraim the Syrian. He dies in 373, and there it's in terms of the word in our flesh for humility. Ephraim thinks that the reason why we have the word in the first place is that God has come down to our level. And he then sees that preachers are to come down to the level of the people. All right, so he has a particular way of looking at that. And I then focus on his Sermon of the Lord. He has various beautiful ways of doing this, and he uses a lot of biblical poetic imagery. Ephraim has a very strong anti-Jewish streak, and so I want to call to mind in terms of how he is a preacher of humility. You could call it a soteriology of humility. When you read him about the Jewish people, it's frankly not very humble. And so I just want to state that, okay? Because even though this is a resource mod that I think these models can help us, it's a critical appropriation. The next one is Gregory of Nazianzus, who dies around the year 390. And it's the word in our flesh for purification and faith. In these virtues, you see how with our chapters, that you have chapter 3, purification and faith, chapter 4, hope of salvation, chapter 5, love, and chapter 6, love of the poor. So faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. It's interesting with Gregory of Nazianzus that he often pairs faith with purification. That you really, for Gregory, cannot have faith unless you're purified by the word, and then have different kinds of bodily and spiritual practices of purity. He uses the word purification literally hundreds of times. And you can think about how St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles talks about how, about God purifying our hearts by faith. So just the conjunction between purity and faith. And he writes the first, what's called treatise of the Christian priesthood, the ministerial priesthood, Oration 2, an apology for his flight that speaks about the responsibilities of being a priest. And it's very much focused on the priest as preacher. The fourth chapter is St. John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom was a favorite of John Calvin, and in the word in our flesh for the hope of salvation. There, what I do to begin the chapter is I have some words from Billy Graham. Each chapter begins with some early Christian, some recent Christian leader. And for people to see the connections between Billy Graham and John Chrysostom's way of appealing to people. And the focus there is hope of salvation. Chrysostom uses this line from 1 Thessalonians in terms of the helmet of the hope of salvation. He uses hope of salvation well over 100 times in his preaching. And that he's just very concerned to get people to understand heaven in the midst of the various details of life. Okay, so one example from John Chrysostom to see the connections between heaven and earth, he wants in all the details of life for people to think about heavenly salvation. So when he preaches on the resurrection and the risen Lord's encounter with the women at the empty tomb, he wants women to think about gold jewelry. And whether, in terms of the gold jewelry, should they sell that jewelry and give to the poor for the sake of heaven? Okay, so to be able to see what he does with that. Chapter 5, Augustine of Hippo, is the word in our flesh for love. And there, in terms of love, to think about how God, the love of God has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit given to us. And that then with this love, we are able to love our neighbor, okay? St. Augustine uses love as a hermeneutic, as a way of interpreting the whole Bible in terms of what the Bible actually says. And then for the one who is to preach the Bible, everything is about love. So he says, if you think that you understand the Bible and you don't grow in love, you have not understood it. Okay, so in terms of just thinking about the reality of love, the next one then has that focus in terms of particular love of neighbor, and that is love of the poor with Leo the Great. Leo is especially famous for Christological doctrine. So he's the Pope during the time of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And Leo has left us 97 sermons. He's the first bishop of Rome to leave us sermons, actually. And over 40 of the sermons talk about love of the poor. Okay, so even though he's most well known for his Christological doctrine, what the people especially experienced was that he really wanted them to give to the poor and to love them. He talks about how they should feel the cold in those who shiver. He really wants that kind of unity with the poor. And he says that no one should despise in any human person the nature that the Creator himself has assumed. Okay, so to be able to see that commonality of love. And then after Leo the Great, we have the last chapter, Gregory the Great, the word in our flesh for acceptance of our weakness. So with the acceptance of our weakness, that the Gregory the Great has this work called the Book of Pastoral Rule. It's in 4 books, and the last book is very short and says that after the preacher has preached, that the preacher should go back and know that the preacher is just a human being. Okay, so in terms of being able to see the difference between God and humanity. Okay, so even though there's strong language of what's called deification, that there's always the difference between God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and humanity. So then there's this conclusion, in terms of a return to patristic preaching, and then the fire of these preachers. Each one, though, is a controversial figure, and I want people to be able to enter into some of those controversies, and then to think about how the word comes into be in our flesh, and for us to realize the power of that word, the power of the word for forgiveness, for healing, for unity, and that a preacher has a special role to do this. One thing that's particularly inspiring me is in terms of St. Augustine's line when he preaches to his people, I don't want to be saved without you. So I just really love that. I don't want to be saved without you. And how each preacher is to communicate the very purpose of the incarnation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Andrew. That's fascinating, and going through those historical figures. I'm inviting our listeners to put questions in the Q&A, and we will probably not get to all of them, but we'll get to some of them. At this moment, I'd like to direct one question to Kyle regarding his research and how you were talking about the practice of Sabbath and how people understand that, if it's worship or if it's rest or if it's really a way of forming identity. And then the question relates to the situation we're in now with this COVID-19 situation where we are apart from one another, and a lot of pastors are kind of worried that people won't come back, that they'll be taking an eternal Sabbath or something. And just wonder if you could reflect on what you've been learning, and what do you think about how that bears out in the near future as we think about coming back to church?
Yeah, so 2 thoughts. Maybe the first one, maybe not quite so directly with your question, but I think one of the really interesting things in our current situation is the sort of being forced into a rest where people have to be at home, right? And they can't do the sorts of things they normally do. Their kids' sports things are canceled, right? Their school activities are canceled. Maybe even their work has been regrettably furloughed or something like that. And the sort of anxiety that produces, I think, really speaks to the sort of uncomfortableness of Sabbath in our culture. But in terms of church services more immediately, I'm hoping, I don't know if this will be true or not, I guess we'll find out, that actually the sort of converse of that will be true, that people will realize how important meeting in person is to them, and that they'll actually realize that they need that more than they thought they did. So maybe it will be possible that people will say, I actually kind of like, being able to go in my pajamas on my couch and, not have to see anyone. I'm hoping, and I think it would be a more biblical approach to say that actually the physical presence, to Andrew's point, is pretty important here, that the becoming flesh still actually matters. And I think I'm hoping people will experienced that. I think you might, I've watched all sorts of online services myself. The ones I've found the most meaningful are the ones that in some ways recreate the physical presence, right? The more you can do that. So even in the ones we've had this weekend or this week, where you see the dancing and you see the physicalness of it, I think still touches a need of what it means to be human, what it means to worship together.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think your answer is giving comfort to some worship leaders and pastors out there listening, so thank you. I'm going to go to Andrew with combine some questions here, and then we'll go to Martin as well. There's a lot of questions about these different presentations. So Andrew, people are wondering both how you what led you to study patristic preaching, how you chose the particular ones that you chose, and then how did the relationship between orality and literacy play into your analysis of these preachings?
Great. Thank you. So as a Dominican friar, I come from what's called the Order of Preachers. So St. Dominic founded the order just over 800 years ago. And then I have been teaching preaching, and I specialized in patristics, so the theology of the early church. So, and when I was little, my dad, when I was in 5th grade for the weekly religion class, my dad was the teacher. He taught the Old Testament and taught with my mom, and she taught the saints. And so it's interesting in terms of the Bible and the saints, how patristic preaching in a special way unites these two childhood loves. So it's like it's something that's very dear to me personally, and then in terms of my life and my ministry. So that's how I was attracted to this. And then in terms of these 7 figures, these are 7 of the most popular, most influential preachers in Christian history. Okay, so in terms of as someone who's historically trained, I like to go back to early times. And one thing I didn't say was that the most important models for these preachers are biblical preachers. So in terms of, with Gregory the Great, he has these homilies on Ezekiel. He says that in Ezekiel, you see particularly that watchman figure of Ezekiel, or that the watchman is called Son of Man, Ezekiel the Son of Man, that he's representing us in our humanity, our weakness. And then, of course, and then in the New Testament, Peter, Paul, and John the Evangelist. Okay, so that these preachers have biblical preachers of both Old and New Testament that they want to emulate. Okay, and so in terms of imitation, and then ultimately it's all about Jesus, because those saints of the Old Testament in some ways communicate him just as the saints of the New Testament do. So those are some of my interests that I have been finding. And then in terms of orality and literacy, that we have only precious few records. So in terms of preaching, for example, we have really fewer than a dozen sermons before Origen. Origen died around 253 or 254 after being persecuted, tortured actually. But before Origen, we have fewer than a dozen sermons. With Origen, we know that he preached hundreds and hundreds of times. Most of his homilies are preserved in Latin, even though he preached in Greek. And then in terms of people, John Chrysostom tells his people to go back to read the Bible. He wants parents to tell their children Bible stories. Hear what you, listen to what we are saying in this church. When you go home, parents, tell your children Bible stories, and he'll review all of those things. So in terms of literacy, sometimes we may think that they're not literate, but there is a literacy there. And then what's most important is actually not reading the Bible, but living by the word. So Augustine uses the example of Anthony of Egypt, the great hermit, St. Anthony, who did not have the ability to read, but he was able to hear the word, and then he lived it perfectly. So Anthony is the model Christian for Augustine. And he, and on Christian doctrine, is telling people that even if they can't read, that they can still live by the word. They can still hear and have their memory at the service of their heart, whereas others may just have books. So, and it's very interesting to look at those combinations.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Martin now, and again, I'm going to try to combine some questions. Folks have noted a couple of things. One, your mention of scripture talking about nations as folks, and whether there be some benefit in thinking more about nativity groups and folk groups rather than nations. Another person noted that some immigrant churches maybe put flags in the sanctuary as a way of communicating loyalty to their new nation that they're joining in. So those are two different aspects, but a more general question is, how do you suggest we clarify a healthy nationalism from a divisive or oppressive nationalism in terms of how we express that, I guess, in worship or in the church?
Yeah, I'll take that last question first. I mean, yeah, in some ways, I'm resistant to the idea of this good nationalism versus bad nationalism. I think as a historian, to think about nationalism is not really necessarily to make this kind of ethical judgment on it. It's rather to see it as a process that happens that gives us something which we ought to look more closely at, if that makes sense. In other words, it's about the existence of nationalism rather than what nationalism does or what people do with it. I mean, it's clear, of course, that certain forms of nationalism do have more destructive real-world effects than others. I'm not doubting that, but I think there's a more fundamental question about nationalism that is worth posing, which is about identity, just in general, and about community and about hope in some ways. And that I'm not sure that the good versus bad nationalism is helpful in that regard. There's a French critic in the 19th century, Ernest Renan, who described the historian. He said the historian is the enemy of the nation. And what he meant by that was not that the historian is the enemy of a particular nation. He just meant that history somehow dissolves the concept and the obviousness of national identity. It suddenly reveals that what seems simple and obvious actually isn't as simple and obvious, and it's full of quite a lot of contradictions. So I'm more interested in my scholarship in thinking to reveal those contradictions of nationalism more than I am of saying there's a good and a bad nationalism, if that makes sense. I know there's lots more to talk about that in that regard. Is it possible to retain that nations in the older sense? Well, I suppose so. I mean, the point about the older sense is, of course, that the nations don't correspond with state boundaries. Now, once you get nation states, then they do generate something of their own reality. So everyone in America watches the same TV news. There is a shared culture. So it's a kind of chicken and egg situation. But certainly in as much as there are distinct people groups, and in fact, we use the word ethnicity, and ethnicity comes from the same root word as nation. It really means the same thing. We often use the word ethnicity to subdivide a nation state. So I think there is some merit in seeing that pluralism that actually exists within a nation, which challenges the simple and obvious claim that everyone is united, when in fact, if you dig a little bit deeper, they're really not, and there's a lot more diversity than nationalism would let on. If that makes sense. When do flags go into churches? This is something I've been interested in this year, and I've asked several historians that have done more work on this than I am, and there's no good study on it. I think you're right that immigrant groups do that. That's one time they do it. I know some churches, I've looked at their records, and they do it in 1976. That's when the flag goes into the church to commemorate the bicentenary of the founding. So I think there's different reasons that the flag has gone in to the church in that regard.
One person was wondering, Martin, if in your research, if you noticed anything in patterns of worship music that reinforced or challenged nationalism. And along with that, I know you commented in your in your report about how worship leaders can implicitly challenge or reinforce nationalism in how they lead worship as well. So thinking about music and worship leadership, what thoughts would you have?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of music itself, rather than the content of the lyrics, the words, I mean, there's clearly a certain genre of worship music that comes out of the American national tradition. In fact, I mean, if you get a chance to connect with another of the scholar-teacher grantees, Monique Ingalls, probably have more to say about this than I will. I mean, it's pretty complex how that works, right? But it may associate, in as much as some of that music sounds like other music that exists within the national frame, it probably does blur the boundary between church and culture, ports kind of music that's out there into the church. I think my point, so the music is hard to make, I think, an exact argument about. The words are perhaps more interesting. I guess, yeah, just to reiterate what I was going to say in that last point, it's some of you might have read it, the book by a few years ago by a British writer called Nick Page. It was called Now Let's Move into a Time of Nonsense. And it was all about particularly the use of archaic language, biblical language, but language that doesn't really meet us in our modern situation. So pastoral language, shepherd language, king language. And of course, we want to honor that that's biblical and that's correct, but at the same time, it's easy to sideline that language or just to say, well, it's kind of Christian language, and not properly address the point of that language, of the kingdom or what was being said in terms that our congregations understand. I think we need more worship. We need more, songwriters to recognize that. And I think the first step of getting there is actually looking at nationalism and understanding what it is and what it isn't, and trying to work like that. I don't mean write a song against nationalism. I mean, take it into account and think about how the gospel responds to it and takes us away from misleading hopes and aspirations and communities to the real one.
Okay. I'm watching questions here. Most of them, honestly, are on the topic of nationalism. That one's picking up some steam here. I'm going to ask you this one, Martin. It said here, many who critique nationalism in the church also critique movements that address wrongs in our nation's foundations, like Black Lives Matter movement, or historically abolition or civil rights on the same basis. They say they are primarily secular movements that are based on power and other identities than Christian identity. So the question is, how might we respond to people who are resistant to movements for social justice because they feel they're not distinctively Christian? And how do we do that while still holding a consistent critique of nationalism?
I guess if I was able to speak to that question, I'm not quite sure I can picture who it is that opposes nationalism and also opposes social justice movements. I think that's a fairly narrow group, maybe some fundamentalists in the classic sense of the term might. But anyway, well, I suppose the answer to that is, the answer with everything is that you shouldn't join any movement on the basis other than your conviction from theology and scripture and what you have been categorized to believe is right and just and true from the Christian scriptures. So I suppose the answer would be, well, don't join it unless you are convinced that you can share some part in this movement's aims. You might not be able to share everything about it, fully integrated with what you believe about the kingdom of God. I suppose that would be the argument. And I think it's possible to find substantial biblical basis for joining, at least sharing in some of the aspirations of both of those movements from the same biblical basis.
Okay. I really appreciate each of you. I appreciate Martin's approach of a historical approach, is taking a longer view on these issues that can be rather controversial. Kyle's approach to thinking about worship and rest and how we live our lives and our identities as Christians, and Andrew's approach to thinking about how the word is proclaimed into our lives and from historical purposes. I think from historical figures, I think some of the preachers listening may have some great ideas here, and they'll be looking for that book to come out as well. And I know you're all writers, and there are books coming and things on that. So we look forward to that. And we're really grateful that you could be with us today and present this research. As was mentioned in another session, following this event, we will provide to all the attendees a list of names and contact or email addresses. So if you do have particular questions, I'm pretty sure all our panelists would be happy to engage by email if you have particular questions that you'd like to ask. So thank you again. We are at our hour. The next session is in, I think, 15 minutes, where we're going to have another roundtable discussion and look at some of the posters of the worshiping communities. So thank you much, and blessings. Enjoy the rest of the day, a roundtable, and then another worship service. Thank you.